Welcome to the fourth episode of Teacher Talk with Doc Rocker. I, as always, am your host, Russ Downey, and with me today is Danton of Doc Rocker Music. And today's episode is all about improvisation, as we've titled Improvisation, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Play a Solo. So, Danton, I figured since it's you and me today, we would get a chance to kind of talk about improvisation, how to teach it, how to approach it in the first place, because it's such a wide open topic, and just how to start talking about it and teach it. So, you want to
Yeah,
expand a little bit
yeah.
on it? What do you
So,
think?
before we jump into that, I just want to make a quick shout out. Before we start, those of you that are following along and watching the episodes and joining up with the Facebook group, thank you so much. For those of you that haven't gotten an invite yet, don't worry, it's coming. Facebook is a little difficult with limiting how many people I can invite at once. I'm trying to go down the whole list of all of our interested people. So it might come as a bit of a shock to all of you that we don't have any guests featured in today's episode. But we're going to shoot for getting a much bigger build of the community as early as next week. So stay tuned for updates and details. You could follow all of my pages. Doc Rocker Music has a Facebook page. There's also a Twitter and Instagram. I know a lot of you guys out there follow me on those platforms too. So just stay tuned. Updates will be on the way, and we'll have a lot of really fun topics to talk about. So to get back to talking improv, it's definitely a really good question of, even the initial question right away of, when is the best time to start teaching improvisation? And that's so many of my answers for a lot of these questions on this talk, not just this talk, but on all of our talks in general, is so many times, since so much of my experiences with private teaching, I'm going to say it depends. I've had ideal times with really, really young beginner students to do improvisation almost immediately. I've had some students that we don't even talk about the concept until they're much more musically mature and advanced. It basically kind of depends not only on a student's abilities and a teacher's abilities. I would say a lot of it depends on just the sheer interest in pursuing improvisation, because you definitely have a large number of students that would perhaps have the ability to improvise and be really good at it, but if there's no interest in doing so, some students are just, I want to learn exactly the solo as Jimi Hendrix did it. I want to learn exactly, I like note for note. I don't want to do my own kind of flair with it. I want to learn exactly what's on the page for me, and that's totally okay. But for those of you that have that interest in improvisation, it really depends on style. That's going to be something we talk about quite a bit today, comparing like improvising in rock and roll compared to improvising in jazz, and all of the different connotations that go with that. So Russ, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think a lot of it, again, it depends, seems like kind of an answer where it's like, okay, well, I guess the situation fits, but you're right. It really does depend on the student as to if you as a teacher or if you as a performer feel you're ready or your student is ready for improvisation. But I'm of the mind that there's not a bad time to introduce it. As a matter of fact, I kind of think it's one of those things that's best introduced in small amounts and returned to over time, kind of like a cyclical curriculum type of
Oh
thing.
yeah, absolutely.
Like one of the best examples of that would be like, let's say for an elementary program, where you wind up having a setup with, let's say, like some org xylophones or metallophones, where you can set up a song where your students are playing a particular a pattern, whether it be double stops or single notes on their own, and then they get a section where maybe they get to take a little bit of soul on their own. But the way their instrument is set up, you take all the bars off that don't sound good with what's being played and let them pick from that. And again, at that sense, you're basically placing arbitrary restrictions on it, but you're also kind of prepping them for the idea that not everything sounds good over everything else. And so if you return to that over time, I think that really starts to kind of, form an idea that, hey, I can create something on my own, but not everything works perfectly, but some things work better than others, and I need to find what works better. And I think because of that, it means that you can approach it quite a few times at different ages. It just depends on how intense you're going to really get into it and what you can actually use in explaining the finer points of it. because compared to most other topics in music education, this is one that you really can't delve deep into until you've started to learn some theory, and usually that means in your teenage years or later.
Right, absolutely. And kind of um, to spin that in the complete opposite direction, something that's, you know, kind of similar to like the ORF strategy of like only having the available notes that will fit. A really easy go-to way that I like to use for beginning piano students is to just use the key of G flat major and just use the G flat major pentatonic, literally just the black keys.
All the black keys.
And you
Yep.
can kind of just do whatever you want, you know, especially in an in-person private lesson. I can very easily, as a teacher, sit on the left side and create like a nice, you know, murmuring bass accompaniment, something like really, really tonally safe and something very, very simple, and say, look, you got free reign of any of the black keys, you know, just don't play the white ones. And it's always a blast with students to explore that. And especially one of the nice things I love about teaching piano is you're not limited in range. You know, you can literally jump all the way to the top end of the range and play on the bottom. You don't have to worry about accounting for a student's ability to play in that range. You simply just have to move your hand to a different part of the instrument. And that can be a really fun way to explore what are all of the tonal possibilities, even at a really early age. You know, how does the same melody sound when I play it in the highest octave in the register? How does it sound when I'm nearest middle C? How does it sound when I'm close to what Danton's doing down on the bottom?
Mhm.
And I think that kind of just opening up that sandbox right away for beginners is a really, really great idea. And you're providing them this really nice, like I said before, safe environment where they can really just freely express themselves and try new things.
Do you find that giving of a more creative type of option for learning for younger students tends to kind of like spur them on to want to learn more because they get to be creative with it? Or do you find it's something that like they enjoy in the moment, but it doesn't kind of push them forward for the other stuff they're working on?
Usually, as far as driving the students' interest into like getting that greater understanding of the ins and outs of how it works and, you know, what more can I do with this, that usually falls on me. I have to kind of guide that. It's like, all right, well, wasn't that fun playing all this stuff with just the black keys? Now let's try a different key, where now we're going to use maybe only the white keys. You do something in the key of C and say, all right, let's avoid the letter F and the letter B. And, you know, and so I usually kind of structure it like that, where I'll put in like, you know, start with like the most open territory that you can really just really do whatever you want. Then we try to like eventually build it into more specific things. And, you know, then it becomes a bit of a musical game of play these notes and avoid these ones. And then you just start adding in more notes to avoid by changing the keys. So yeah, I feel that there might be a way that you can have it be student driven, but I feel like that part has to largely be teacher driven, where you have to kind of plan ahead and structure out like, all right, I'm going to have them do this key, that key, the other key. And once they finish those 3 steps or 5 steps or 10 steps, then it's like, all right, well, then what are some options we can do to get away from major pentatonic?
Mhm.
You know, so, and again, that always comes down to style then too. You know, am I teaching them more like as a rock musician or as a jazz musician or as a classical musician, where classical improvisation is even a whole
Yeah.
different ballpark entirely,
Hmm.
which I usually, I can't really speak from a whole lot of experience. I've never really taught it all that much. I mean, I've very, very briefly dabbled in my college years with some of that kind of stuff, but not really anything much more than that. So that would have to be a topic for another day. But
Well, I think the funny part is that in bringing that up, you do make a good point. Is that like it's such a different thing, especially for like classical versus rock and jazz, that a lot of times students who are part of the classical tradition almost get no training in improvisation at all. Literally,
yeah,
it's like it's not part of the standard thing they would typically learn. Like, you know, if you were going through, let's say, an orchestra program, you may wind up going from elementary all the way up through high school and not encounter a situation where you have to improvise
or even
and
get an opportunity to
or
improvise.
get an even opportunity. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, you're entirely right with that. I think you know part of that obviously I guess is due to the style of music, the way it was written, the kind of
Yeah. The fact that it's written for an ensemble in the first place leaves
that
a little
too.
bit less wiggle room for free
Well,
flowing kind of stuff.
true. I mean, you know, when you're writing stuff for like a 60-person ensemble, obviously you're not going to really have a whole lot of wiggle room for solos. But, you know, I think the shame of it is that that means a whole bunch of students are kind of getting not left behind, but it's a part of music and a large part of the tradition of music that they don't
That
get a
they're
chance
just
to
missing out
explore.
on. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, it's kind of interesting because I mean, we both, kind of came up as musicians through the instrumental, like the concert band style of learning. And, most of the time in a concert band setting, there's not a whole lot of a chance for improvisation, but there is if you join a jazz band, obviously.
Yeah.
But then that also brings up the issue, how do you teach students how to improvise? What do you do? How, is it one of those things where you're like, well, just take some notes and hopefully it works out? No, I mean, obviously
Yeah,
you
you
don't want
definitely
to.
can put in some semblance of structure. And there's a lot of really great frameworks you can use.
Well, I mean, I guess my question with that is that like those frameworks you're talking about, like you mentioned, obviously using like a pentatonic scale as a means of basically,
Mhm.
putting a framework around something that you can pick from notes to use that will work well with what you're playing. Can that be equally applied to individual students and to ensembles? Can you teach them both in that manner? Is it a worthwhile thing to try and treat them the same way? Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah. And that depends too. I would argue that you can. Speaking from my own personal experience doing jazz band, like my senior year of high school, I only did it for 1 year, but I loved it. But by the time I got into jazz band for trombone, I already had a decade of piano lessons under my belt and a lot of like actual playing experience. And I already had all the theory background. I knew all my scales and keys and how to read music. And so it was really easy for my band director to just like give me, all right, you use this scale for this song and just kind of go ham. And I would, and let me see if I could find where those notes are on the trombone and kind of play around. And I would always jump at the opportunity for taking solos because I just found that a really fun way to explore and try new things on a new instrument at the time for me. That was really, really new. So like if you have a student that has like that background where you could just give them the framework of, all right, we're in the key of G minor. So you could use a G minor scale, you could use a G Dorian scale, you could use a G blues scale. And like, here are the different scales you can try and here and just, go nuts, have fun. But like, as far as like, if you, let's say hypothetically speaking, you're directing a high school jazz ensemble and it's all freshmen, it's the first year of the program. All the kids are from like a pretty well fed middle school program where they have a really good let's say they have a really good technical foundation on their instruments, but they've never done anything jazz at all ever, so like they're unfamiliar with some of the notation. They're all completely blank slates for teaching to improvise. In that case, I wouldn't just slap them with all these different scales and say go nuts. Even if they know how to play those scales and can navigate it, I feel like it might be a bit overwhelming for them, and you might want to kind of think of maybe like scaffolding that into
Yeah.
something a little more manageable. So like maybe like we spend like 2 weeks just with the G minor scale and like even not even the full thing, maybe just picking like the first 5 notes, like a pentascale as it's called in piano world. I don't know if
Mhm.
that's a thing for other instruments, but
I
this
mean,
idea of
I've
just,
heard the term before. Yeah.
yeah. So a pentascale usually just refers to the first 5 notes, do to sol, in a
Mhm.
major or minor key. So like something like that that would be my strategy going into that sort of
Okay.
scenario. But definitely, I've always leaned more on the theoretical side of like use that background and like explain the scales and explain the keys and simply go from there. And you can kind of like use those strategies to really effectively teach improvisation on a really basic level. And then you could build that over the course of the program, depending on how much time you have.
No, I mean, you're definitely right. I know one of the ways I've used a manner of teaching improvisation before, again, is to kind of limit the choices of notes you have available to you. But I actually I find that like the times I've taught it, I've used basically like chord arpeggios as a means of kind of corralling us down to like let's say corralling us down to like a seventh chord, of
Mhm.
which you have four chord tones to work with. Let's say like we got ourselves down to like a minor seventh chord, basically. Like we'll take like a C minor seven, for example. So C,
Okay.
E flat, G, and B flat, of which, once you finally figured out like what notes are in there, you talk about the fact that, well, if you're looking for notes that are going to work well with that chord, well, obviously you have four already. They're not terribly adventurous, but chord tones work because they're the chord tones. So maybe let's add one more to it and give us something outside of the chord. And you probably know exactly what note I'm going for here, but I'm going to say, let's add F and give us, a style of, a pentatonic scale of sorts, or maybe we can add F and F sharp and give us a blues scale. In that sense. And you wind up having like four safe tones to pick from and two more adventurous ones, obviously to different degrees, if you will, but to the point where your students can pick from that. And, you wind up having like four safe tones to pick from and two more adventurous ones, obviously to different degrees, if you will, but to the point where your students can pick from that. And, you wind up having like four safe tones to pick from and two more adventurous ones, obviously to different degrees, if you will, but to the point where your students can pick from that they can try it out, and it gives one with a little bit of tension and one that's kind of just a very innocent passing tone of sorts that they can pick and choose from. And one thing I've told them before is, if you don't feel comfortable picking out different rhythms to use, try just steady rhythms until you get down what pitches you feel comfortable with. And then once you have some ideas, start changing around the rhythm a little bit. So I found that in that order of pitch, then rhythm usually tends to work well. And
Absolutely.
a lot of it's because that understanding of harmonic language and how notes and chords fit together is something that takes a decent amount of time to get a hold on unless you're already playing a harmonic instrument from the start.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a really, really interesting strategy. I never really thought of it that way. Of course, I've taught in the past, using chord tones as guides, but not setting it up where like using the chord tones as a starting point to then gradually start feeding in the notes of the scale. It's a really, really cool idea. And I'm looking forward to trying that in lessons with my students. But it definitely, and what I really like about that strategy is you start, so you could, even within the safe confines of chord tones, the different chord tones have a different color against the harmonic backdrop. You might find if you sit on the minor third, for example, on a C minor 7, but you're doing it in the higher octave, that's going to sit with the ensemble a lot differently than sitting on the B flat or the G. And all of those notes technically are going to fit, they're going to work, but they're all going to have a little bit of their own. And then you could start to develop a little bit of this tonal language for the student. So like, I want to kind of gravitate towards the fifth because I like the way that note sounds. So I'm gonna then as I start adding in my F, my F sharp, eventually my A flat, my D, and I do the full scale, I'm gonna keep getting myself toward the fifth and then expand that into other chord tones throughout the progression. Maybe I land on the fifth of an F minor 7 that's in the progression, or a fifth of an A flat, a major 7, or whatever. Just it's all hypothetical right now, but I think that's really interesting. Is starting with the chord tones. I've never really, like I said, I've never done that, and that's really cool. And I'm looking forward to trying that.
Well, I think it's something that allows you to give your students a kind of like a safe zone to pick from that they can kind of duck in and out of as they try notes that don't necessarily belong to the chord or fit necessarily well with it. I think one of the things that, more than any other type of music situation in learning, this is not one of those ones where you can open a book or look at the music and get a rough idea of what you need to do. This is one of those ones like we've talked about in previous podcasts, previous episodes, with like the concept of like singing in front of people, with it being a vulnerable type of situation. This is one of those ones
Yeah,
where
totally.
you have students who will shy away from taking solos because they don't want to play in front of other students, other people. So I think it's on us as teachers to kind of take away that fear by kind of limiting the choices and broadening out little by little, or at
Yeah,
least that's
setting it up so that you can't really fail per se. You can't really mess it up.
right.
And
But
it's a
that
great way
also
to
begs
break
the
the ice
question,
for
then, like,
those more timid students.
exactly, and that also begs the question, then, like, how do you approach chromaticism in that sense? What do you do? What notes do you go for first to tell? Like I mentioned, obviously, like adding like an F sharp into a C minor scale, basically to give you that blues scale style
Mhm.
deal. But how do you approach that? Because I mean, as we all know, some of the best solos out there either wind up having, really distinct rhythms, really distinct harmony, or distinctive melody, and usually chromaticism winds up becoming a big part of that. So how do
Yeah,
you?
absolutely. And I don't even touch chromaticism without my most, like, until the students are at like the most advanced stage, like to the point where they know all of their scales inside and out. Then we start talking about, okay, how is a sharp 11 different than an 11? How is a sharp 9 different from a flat 9, different from a natural 9? And what one do you want to kind of sit on in this context, or as opposed to that context? So I don't even play with chromaticism at all until I have a student who's really, really mastered the scales, because I want to make sure that they can get, going back to the whole chord tones idea, I've always taught it with a kind of more scalar method. Like, all right, let's go. And you can use your steps from the fifth down a whole step, down a whole step to the minor third, down a half step, down a whole step to the root. And you could use the 2, the 4, and the 6 as ways to connect your chord tones and make stepwise melodies, because you're literally just playing the scale, and it's going to work in all of those contexts because theoretically the notes fit. So as far as like deviating from that with chromaticism, that it makes me think of modes, like, oh, okay, if we're like, maybe the jam is in C Dorian instead of C minor. So like, all right, let's play with the natural 6 and we have to now avoid the flat 6. I'm like, that stuff I usually save until, like I said, I really know I have a student who's mastered the basics first. And then we start like purposefully hitting those chromatic tones to get some really interesting effects.
Fair enough. I mean, that makes sense too. I guess that kind of begs the question though, for somebody like, let's say you had a student who just joined a jazz band in middle school, brought you a piece of music to take a look at for piano and said, my teacher wants me to take a solo for this. How do you approach pitch choice? How do you approach rhythm choice for a solo? What do you do? Besides, obviously, take a look at the harmonic language and, just analyzing the chords down for what you're going to be using as a framework. What do you do in that case?
So in a case like that, I like to apply more of like the classical theory composition mindset of like, all right, let's say they're playing a tune that has a distinctive melody that they play several times. They have a pretty big part. Let's say it's a piano player, right? And they're playing a pretty big part of the melody in the head, say, of whatever the tune is. So usually my first go-to of explaining ideas to students to give them that kind of catalyst to let them start playing is just take a little snippet out of the main melody, and then see how many different ways you can play it. Let's say it's for example, let's say we're using the lick, right? Just for an example, something like really simple. That's a nice little 4 or 5 note idea. And it's like, let's take that little idea and see how many different ways we can develop it. Can we put it on the downbeat? We can play with the melody rhythmically, right? By displacing it by half a beat. So let's put it on the upbeat and see how that affects. And by doing that, I've always found that naturally snowballs very quickly for a student into then developing their own melodic ideas. And it all comes from like that kind of take that little seed out of the main melody and then do different things with it. Let's try to transpose it across each of the chords. That sort of kind of thing. Where like just doing something like that can be really simple and really effective. And that way you're taking so much of the pressure off of a student of like, I have to come up with this super interesting melody in my solo or it's going to falter and fail. It's like, no, use what's already here and put your own little spin on it. That's what I do with a lot of my students. I've always liked that strategy. If let's say you don't have a melodic framework to start with, it's just a blank slate. Let's say it's, it's something like Watermelon Man, where it's like this real, like kind of more riff oriented, not so much melodically driven piece, where, it's more of a kind of a blank slate. You could just kind of really just do whatever you want. In that case, it's like, all right, well, let's take, kind of going back to the chord tones idea, but let's say not even doing the full tonic minor 7. Let's say we're just doing like just the root and the third. Just pick 2 of the chord tones, and we're gonna harmonically drive all of our guide tones in our solo of, okay, let's say the progression, even if it's just doing something like a 12-bar blues, take those 2 notes, do something rhythmic with them. And then we start gradually, going into like adding in different steps to connect it. And then you do the same thing for the other chords. So the root and third of the 4 chord, the root and third of the 5 chord, and then rinse, repeat that entire process over and over again using different chord tones and combinations, right? Let's use the minor 3rd and the 5th. Let's use the root in the 5th. Let's use the root in the minor 7th. And, and then we gradually, like I would take probably an entire lesson with a student. Let's say we have like a half hour or 45-minute private lesson. It's like we would go through a whole head of the blues with that sort of strategy, right? And then until we've kind of exhausted every permutation possible, and then we start combining them into different flavors. I've always found that to be a really nice way to gradually ease a student into coming up with melodies from scratch, it's kind of like the chord tone idea, but like you break it down into different steps. Something that my guitar teacher had me do when I was first learning to solo. And at this point I was maybe like 16, 17, like in high school, getting like to that point. And he would have me even start with a more baby step than that. Just take the root of each chord. You only have 1 note and that's it. And then what can you do with it rhythmically? And then now from that starting note, let's say we're in the key of C minor for this example. And, so we start on C and basically keep yourself grounded on the C as much as possible. So in the case of a 12-bar blues, when we switch from C minor to F minor, stay on the C because you're still on a chord tone, and only move if you're on a chord that doesn't have a C in it. And if that's
Okay.
the case, move by the smallest step possible. So in this case, if it was in like, let's say it's an Aeolian and it's just all minor, so C minor, F minor, G minor. So the only choice I have going to the 5 chord is I could go up a step to D or down a step to D flat, and that's it. And
Okay.
then from there, kind of gradually like, all right, now let's do the same thing, but start on the 3rd, so starting on the E flat. And then, okay, we could stay on the E flat for the F minor 7. And then this time I don't have a choice. I have to go down to the D for the G minor because it's only a half step compared to the whole step up to F for a G minor 7. So like only like purposefully like, and by doing that whole process, you start to kind of find it's sort of like, this is like the really deep way to kind of do what you were talking about of like, let's have all the chord tones as our safe notes, and that's all we can pick. And then we could start to gradually fill in and add in some notes from there. By doing it this way, like this is something I would do with like a super advanced player, to like first ground them and discipline them and get them to really think deeply about the stepwise relationships of the chord tones. And really, and also inadvertently teaching the student that you can really do a lot with just one note. You don't really need to be flying up and down all over the neck on the guitar, or up and down the keyboard, or up and down the range of your flute if you're doing flute. I don't know. I would love to explore flute and doing flute solos and stuff with it, like a high school kid in jazz band. That's my dream someday, is to get a flute student that can do that kind of stuff. So anyway, so those are a number of different strategies when it comes to teaching a student to solo from scratch. There's basically, for me, it comes down to the melodic approach of dissecting an existing melody and using that as our stepping block, or the harmonic approach, where we could either do kind of what Russ suggested with the chord tones to start, and then we add in a note here and there until they have a fully fledged scale, or we do the really deep dive and do the one note at a time method. Or some combination of all of that above.
I like the idea of taking like a snippet of a melody from a tune, because it would not be the first time that's been done in history for a whole bunch of songs. I probably could count on like several people's hands and feet the number of rock and pop songs I've heard where the solo was literally just an expanded version of the actual melody itself. Like, I'll give a great example of a tune that's really well known too. So the song "That's All" by Genesis, of which, of course, I'm using Genesis as an example.
Well, sure, nothing wrong with that.
But at the same time, like, that's basically still the whole entire solo just is, which is literally just an extrapolation of the main melody. And then it just winds up moving downwards in a pentatonic scale over 2 octaves. And it's basically completely built off of the melody itself. And it fits.
And it's a great solo. And it's
right.
It's not super inventive. It doesn't pull in a whole bunch of random things from scratch. It takes all of the existing content of the song and builds that into its own unique identity.
Right. And the thing is that, like, you're right. It's not a super inventive solo, but it's effective. I think a lot of us.
I think it makes it more effective.
Exactly. I think a lot of us get caught up with this idea when we're first learning how to solo that we have to. That it's more.
We have to be the most original thing on the planet.
It has to be super original. It has to have a bunch of notes so people think I'm doing a great job with it. And like, I'll never forget my first solo that I ever took, and this is back when I was still just playing drums shortly before I started learning how to play piano, and it was for a jazz band, and I had never taken a solo before on drum set in that setting, of which I was nowhere near close to what I would consider to be a good jazz drummer. It took me a long time before I, gathered that appreciation for it and got better at it. But my first solo was literally like I was borrowing bits and pieces of beats from songs that I knew and kind of like taking bits and pieces and cobbling them together to form something. And sure, it was kind of like a Frankenstein's monster of like, drum solo parts. But that was actually a really, really helpful experience because, like, it's tough to come up with something super ridiculously original that hasn't been done before when you have a ton of source material out there of solos that have been played, of tunes. I mean, how many times can have tunes like Giant Steps be played and then soloed over top of? You know what I mean?
Right. The possibilities are infinite.
Exactly. I think most of us get caught up with having to be super original, that we kind of hit ourselves with some choice paralysis rather than just stop
Yeah,
worrying about it.
I would agree 100%. And that could serve as a really good segue to one of our other talking points for today, of talking about listening to existing solos to get ideas. Listening. So like let's say we're still on the jazz train here, and we're working with like a public school jazz ensemble of all high school kids that are kind of getting into this. So what would you hit them with? What are some ways you can kind of like, do you have like a sort of listening list, or like a list of different artists?
I have a good example of this. So when I was in middle school jazz band, one of the things my teacher did at the very start of the like the first rehearsal of the ensemble was give everybody, there was a list, and he gave everybody a CD to go buy by famous jazz artists. I remember because the one I had to go buy was like the Essential Count Basie, and the idea, yeah, which was pretty awesome.
Very cool. Yeah.
Nowadays thinking about it, I'm like, that's pretty awesome. When I was like 12 years old and I'm a drummer, I'm like, all right, fair enough. But the idea was not only to go and buy it and listen to it, but we would swap the CDs every week.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool.
Which was a really cool concept. And I wish I had taken more away from it when I was younger, because that concept now would be like, that's fantastic. I would sit down and listen to this and like hear all these different ideas. And I think you're right. I think a lot of times for like an ensemble, you can, I guess the term is, you can kind of lead a horse to water, but you can't, always get it to drink.
You can't make it drink the water. Yeah.
I think, one of the things that's helpful to do is to actually spend some time doing some listening, because, listening is one of those things where most of us think of it as like this thing we either do while we're doing something else, or, while we're not doing something, but it's an activity in and of itself. It's an analytical mental activity. And if you're really listening for like, I shouldn't say if you're really listening for it, but it's part of listening to it that you kind of take in, wow, that's really cool what they did for that solo. Like, I want to rewind that back and, go listen to that again. And I found myself being that way as I got older. And the shame of it is that, like I said, I wish I had had a greater appreciation for it when I was younger. But, most of the time when it came time for solos that I wanted to listen to, they were drum solos rather than anything else. Of which that means, if it was anything jazz based, it was Buddy Rich you were going to listen to play.
Yeah, because he's clearly the only jazz drummer who's ever existed.
Well, not necessarily that, but like,
he's easily one of the most famous.
Yeah, his solos were legendary.
Yeah,
like to the point where they
fantastic drummer.
They put him up in a drum battle with Animal from the Muppet Show. So
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot all about that.
But I mean, it's one of those things where I wish that I had paid more attention to it when I was younger. But I think that's a really good concept of like, a lot of the listening itself is something you probably should do as a group and talk about it, because a lot of students, are sometimes more reluctant to talk about like what they're listening to and to actually critique it, either because they feel like they're saying something super obvious, or two, because they're not sure what to take away from it.
Yeah. And I like the idea of doing it in an ensemble rehearsal, taking like the first 5-10 minutes of your allotted time to like, let's listen to this one tune and let's pick apart the solo and like let that conversation happen in that healthy, safe environment. I think that's a really, really good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things where you can actually kind of like foster this environment of like helping students to build solos, and then they have like a network of other students around and say like, you should try doing this, or like, it might be kind of cool if you try this rhythm, or this little lick is kind of cool, and like you should play the lick and put that in there somewhere. Or I remember even seeing videos of some jazz ensembles where somebody's goal was to put like one of the saxophone licks from the Mario Kart 8 soundtrack into one of their solos.
Oh, that soundtrack is fantastic.
Yeah, and the thing is that like, to me, that's awesome. That's a really cool concept of like just this referential thing of like, I heard this thing that's cool and I want to play it. And I think sometimes people get caught up on the idea that they can't like borrow bits and pieces from other solos, but we have an entire history of music for like several hundred years where one composer would take a piece of music or a melody from another composer's piece of music and write something around it, either as a means of like referencing or paying homage to, or in some cases throwing shade at other composers. But at the same time, that's something that I think the modern music industry has kind of put like a faux pas about, or like a stigma about, that you can't like borrow bits and pieces of other solos. But like, let's take an example of somebody who, unfortunately just passed away, but think how many guitarists borrowed parts of like solos or concept ideas for solos from somebody like Eddie Van Halen.
Yeah.
Like even the
It's
concept of,
interesting you should bring up Van Halen. I want to do a quick little plug. We just
I
aired
saw
one of
that.
our Rock Talk episodes just earlier this week. We aired it on Eddie, and we talked about him and, you know, his legacy and his music, and, you know, especially how little of his stuff I know, because I really don't know him that well, and that's a shame. But yeah, so even and getting to the point where like you could even take that whole like listening rotation idea a step further, and like let's say you have like a small list of, you know, 2 or 3 saxophonists, and you have your saxophone section listen to, you know, of course, you know, Charlie Parker and Coltrane, and, you know, and then you have, and like I like the idea that's really interesting to like just listen to Coltrane for like a week and then switch with your partner, and then now you have Charlie Parker and they have Coltrane, and like to really kind of see what, you know, you could do the same thing with your drummers, you could do the same thing with your pianists, you could do so. Anyway.
no, but I mean, you're right. It's kind of a cool idea. I think a lot of what is important, at least to me, is that part of our duty as music teachers is not only to teach the actual, you know, how to and what to do when it comes time for playing, but I think it's also something that's important for us to teach the history about it and kind of, you know, teach the tradition of it too. It's
Yeah,
something that, you know,
absolutely.
some people would say, well, you know, you're supposed to be learning how to play, not learning about the history of it, but the history is the playing just in the past, and it's, you know, all those parts kind of form what we take to this modern day. Like some of the, you know, most well-known modern artists out there, um, they grew up listening to artists from in the past. They listened to stuff that was older than them or older than their parents. And it's just, it's really important. I think it's important. I know quite a few music teachers who probably agree with that too. I think it's one of those things where we do need a greater emphasis on it when it comes time for like being in a school or an ensemble setting, because music is meant to be experienced and shared, not necessarily be like consumed as an individual person. And then when it comes time to make music, it's just you play what's on the page and then come up with random stuff. No,
Yeah,
it's like an all.
there's a definite art to improvisation, and I think taking this multifaceted approach of teaching history, teaching tradition, teaching style, you know, like compare you when you're talking jazz, just take any decade, you know, compare like the 20s Dixieland to 30s big band to 40s bebop, and like even within jazz itself, there are so many of these little subgenres, and you know, I think taking that time to really put all of that content under a more focused lens, and really, because I mean, like when I was in high school, I didn't really get that. It was like, here's like, so I just found like a giant like 100 plus jazz great compilation CD set, and was just like, I just jumped in and listened to all sorts of stuff and had no clue what it really was, because for our rehearsals it was just playing, which was great. You know, I thought the rehearsals were super well run, and we had a lot of chances to freely improvise and experiment and play, but it definitely it created an environment where, you know, there were like a couple kids that soloed all the time and a couple kids that never soloed. And I think if there was like a more like kind of a leveled approach of like, let's do like actual designated time to sit down and listen to a specific artist or a specific style. Not to say you have to devote a significant chunk of your instructional time to doing that, but even just taking a little bit, you know, 2 minutes before the start of your rehearsal to really explore that and create that conversation and create that culture where every student feels that they could contribute something, I think it would be even more effective than what my experience was as a student.
Well, no, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. And once again, this is that same argument I always seem to come back to of, you know, having time to teach skills and history and versus having to work on concert, you know, stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, I feel like I'm going to say this like 1,000 times. It's literally like the nature versus nurture argument in psychology. But to me personally, you know, besides the fact that you have stuff to learn for a concert, when you're joining an ensemble that's playing stuff of a particular genre, part of the reason you're there is to also learn about that genre and learn about
Yeah,
the
of
history of
course.
it. And, you know, and I think that's a big part of it too. I think that's how we get um, some of the great kind of not crossovers in musical history, but some of the great like combinations of multiple styles. And the funny part is that one of the things I did want to talk about was the concept of like rock solos versus like jazz solos. But I find myself basically saying, well, let's combine both the ideas and talk about Steely Dan or something like that. But, you know, oddly enough, you know, they're a great example of something where you had like some rock sensibilities and jazz sensibilities both mixed together in a setting that you may not have always had that going on. I mean, sure, there were jazz fusion groups, but not something that was a little bit more mainstream sounding. Like
Mhm.
I'll give you a great example. Probably one of the best guitar solos I ever heard in what most people would consider to be a rock tune with some jazz sensibility would be like Kid Charlemagne off of the Royal Scam album by Steely Dan. The guitarist was Larry Carlton, and absolutely a fantastic solo. And it does use a lot of more complex melodic and harmonic concepts and rhythm as well, but it's a fantastic guitar solo in a tune by a band that a track or two later we'll be playing something that sounds like it came from a big band jazz band. So I think it's kind of an interesting concept because those two traditions of soloing from both sides of it are not as far removed as you might think, and the through point between them obviously is blues music, but um, it kind of brings us to the point of talking about those different kind of solos and how you approach them, what you do with them. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, we wanted to talk about rock and jazz solos, so let's talk about rock and jazz solos a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good. So, I mean, speaking from my own personal experience, I really digging into learning how to play a proper jazz solo probably didn't happen to me until I joined a college level jazz ensemble as a piano player and had some opportunities to play actual piano solos in it. Um, I mean, it's funny for me, like doing it on trombone in high school was so much easier because a lot more of our stuff was more kind of like blues and rock oriented anyway.
Mhm.
And I had so many more limits as a trombone player, a literal limited on range, a literal limit. I can only play one note at a time. I mean, unless I wanted to be crazy and do like multiphonics, but I wasn't trying to do that during a jazz band solo. It was just ridiculous. So, but like, so like having like that real limited palette of available options led me to what I feel. I mean, I think I performed really well as a trombone soloist on the solos I did take because they were really, really smartly put together and tasteful. And because I worked within like it, but now all of a sudden now I'm on piano and it's like, well, I could literally do anything. What do I even do? And like, it was funny because so much of my piano playing up until that point was so rock based, and like, all right, I can easily, I just jump in on any rock song and like solo and do whatever and be super comfortable. And like immediately like was turning heads doing like my solo techniques as a rock musician in a jazz
Mhm.
ensemble because I thought, oh, it's the same thing, rock and jazz, and it's all the same scales, and I know what I'm doing and whatever, and I would just do whatever. And I turned a lot of heads. They're like, what is that? That was interesting. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, geez, I really got to figure out what I'm doing here and learn a little bit more properly how to kind of play with a jazz language. Even though it's all the same notes and scales, it could not be more different, at least for me, from my experience learning about how to solo in a jazz style for the first time. Like I still don't claim to be anything of an expert on jazz soloing. For me, it's always been rock, but
Well, I mean,
they are definitely different. I can tell you
I
that
can
much to
definitely tell you
start.
just from listening to a bunch of stuff. Um, Jazz soloing is so much more melodic versus harmonic. Now, granted, if you're playing an instrument that can only play one note at a time, you have no other options.
Mhm.
But say you're playing, guitar in a rhythm section for a jazz ensemble, you're playing piano. In those situations, you find that it's a lot more like melody over chords than it is, like riff style soloing.
Mhm.
And it's interesting too because there are times when the two do cross over, but if you wind up playing one in the other, it sounds like it's
Really
kind of like,
sounds out of place.
yeah, it's a fish out of water situation. It really
Yeah,
is.
that was
And
exactly how I felt for a
yeah,
long time.
exactly. And
Took
the
me the
funny
whole
part is,
semester.
again, I find it interesting that the two do cross over quite often in the history of music, but
Mhm.
that they also wind up being quite so different. And I think a lot of it comes down to the complexity of the harmonic language, because when you're talking about playing chords that are like, you wind up having, 5, 6 tones to a chord versus like 2 or 3 if you're playing power chords or triads. Obviously, you have a lot more you have to stipulate on in terms of what you can do. It's kind of like, stepping through an obstacle course versus being able to just run straight over top of it. I guess is the
Yeah,
best way.
that's a really good analogy. I like that.
I mean, it like I said, even using that example, the Steely Dan tune, with the Larry Carlton solo, a lot of that solo was mostly melodic in nature, and that was for a rock tune essentially. So you can use them, but I think there's some key differences. And again, like I said, melodic for jazz versus harmonic more for rock music. But I think there's even a rhythmic difference to a lot of it as well. Um, I can tell you right now that when it comes time for rock music, it always seems like it's a lot more less dependent on syncopation as a means of kind of like propelling a solo. And I mean, you could think of half the rock tunes you've heard of out there with, you know, guitar solos that are riff based, or you may wind up having something that's not nearly as reliant on syncopation as a means of um, giving you an interesting solo to listen to as you would for a jazz tune, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But you know, it's just an interesting concept, and I think it's kind of cool to teach both depending on, you know, what instrument you're learning. But the circumstances are, you know, something that you could teach it for multiple instruments. You could teach both styles and have a chance to, you know, kind of enjoy, you know, what you're doing for both, and find yourself being comfortable doing both. I mean, you know, like I was saying with rock solos as well, I think I think a big part there tends to be the use of repetition, and, you know, certain phrasing when it comes time for actually making the solos more interesting to listen to as you move from like parts of chord progressions to another part of a chord progression, rather than having like a set progression throughout a solo section, or even a
Mhm.
background part that goes behind it. But that importance of repetition and phrasing also kind of leads you from A to B when it comes time for the solo itself. I mean, one of the things I did want to talk about too was that importance of repetition in soloing and phrasing, and how you make it work to your advantage. I mean, I'm sure you have some examples of that you've done in the past.
Yeah, well, I guess I can kind of circle back to my experience of kind of learning how to properly solo in more of a jazz style than, you know, like I feel like a lot of my jazz ensemble experience in college was kind of like trying to break the rock musician in me and like really like try to avoid, you know, because I would like channel my inner Rick Wakeman fanboy and like do all the kind of stuff that he would do, which was great because rock and classical in that regard had so much more crossing over than rock and jazz would, which is ironic because historically speaking, it should be the opposite.
Right.
But yeah, so it was like it was really funny for me to get a lot of those eye-opening experiences learning. So a really great technique that helped me a lot that I'd like to share is so we were working on, you know, like a short tune. I forget what the actual tune was, to be honest, but um it was a really rich chord progression, you know, that kind of circled through. It was like a nice circle of fifths kind of thing, so it had lots of
Mhm.
different chords and it modulated pretty frequently, which was really fun. And what we did is we started with just hitting the root and the third, whether it was a major third or a minor third, depending on the chord. And we started just playing through the whole head, but instead of playing the melody, just playing, you know, doo 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 doo, you know, and just hitting with the
Mhm.
same little swing eighth note rhythm, hitting those two tones on each chord and being able to connect it all the way through and just play the song like that. And then the professor who ran, in this case, it was a jazz combo. So it was like myself, a guitar player, a bass player, and a drummer. And that was it. It was like a really small kind of thing. I think maybe we had, no, that was it. So like the only melody was me and guitar. We didn't even have a horn in the combo. So it was
Okay.
a really small thing. And so it gave us a lot of time to really play around with some stuff. And it was super fun. But so then we went through the whole chart again, but now we're using, instead of 1-3, 1-2-3. We're connecting it with a step.
Okay.
You know, and doing that all the way through, and then adding the fifth, you know, kind of going through 1-2-3-5 and
Mhm.
connecting it for each and every chord, and then, you know, literally doing that several times, and having that sort of, and like teaching us to like really use the chord tones to construct your own kind of more melodic solo instead of like, you know, you can't really hit blue notes, and except for like specific places where it's really really intentional to do so for a
Mhm.
specific kind of, in the greater context of creating a line. You know, I feel like rock soloing is so much more kind of like hitting little things over and over again and kind of play. And, you know, we could talk a little bit about like that repetition idea, you know,
Mhm.
like look at like the solo for Freebird, for example. Like we're like
Yeah.
how much.
Ba, 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 da, da,
Right.
da,
There's a
da,
lot of
da,
like
da,
emphasis
da,
on
da.
repeating a short little riff like idea. And that just does not work in jazz at all. And
Right.
it was really cool for me to like, oh, let me just go through and just do all my little arpeggios. And by doing that, it like opened up a whole door of like, oh, I can kind of, and then I can do that backwards, you know, beep doo beep beep beep, you know, that kind of,
Right.
and then like, and just, and all of a sudden now it's like, it just opens up this whole, you know, land of different directions you could go, and it's a lot easier to kind of think. And then it's like, all right, I'm going to jump up to my 9 and then come back down for the
Mhm.
next chord, because then I'm thinking ahead of the progression, and like, and all of a sudden it just made for so much better soloing from all of us, you know, myself, the guitar player, whoever else at the time was soloing. And it was really fun to apply that into into the ensemble setting when I was
Mhm.
playing piano for a full size jazz band. And it was really cool to like plug that same stuff in to a different set of tunes. So that was a technique that really worked for me. And I feel like as much as you don't want to like discriminate when you're teaching, like I feel like you kind of should put rock soloing and jazz soloing in two different camps and teach them as two separate things,
Mm-hmm.
because the overall design philosophy behind properly playing a solo in those two different styles, at least for me, was just so very different. And it's of course, then you can explore like, let's separate them first, and then we could always explore how they overlap and intermingle. And there's a lot, nothing's black and white in music, but being able to kind of like, let's like really forcefully separate these two things. And I think that would be a really good concept for like an aspiring jazz band director out there in like a high school or middle school setting, even if like kind of, explore like teach rock and jazz as two separate things. And then we can sort of build on that and go back into how they're so similar in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, the funny part is that like just in you mentioning like kind of singing the changes with just like using the root and the third, it almost starts to naturally turn it into a phrase of sorts. Like it almost sounds like it could have literally been like the lead, the head melody for a jazz tune, which kind of begs the point, having those kind of changes and considering, phrasing your stuff that way by using, repeat ideas of, okay, I'll play the root in the third or the root second in the third, with this rhythmic idea. I have to wonder if sometimes that winds up kind of not doing more of the work for you, but guides you in that direction regardless, because that's kind of what the music
definitely puts you on those rails and lets you make a lot less mistakes.
I mean, I could tell you from personal experience as a drummer, when it comes time for soloing in rock music versus jazz music, jazz solos are always about syncopation. It's a big part of it. Rock solos are a totally different beast for drummers. It really is. And when I said before that there's less syncopation, I don't mean that as a bad thing. I mean that it tends to be a lot more of a thundering style versus a more finesse-based style. As you wind up putting those solos together. Like I think of the years I spent as a teenager listening to Neil Peart from Rush playing drum solos and just listening to what he was doing, and it was basically like tons of different changing patterns between different drums, but usually there was a pretty consistent rhythm of constantly working with 16th notes or 16th note triplets over like a particular bass and hi-hat foot pattern. And those type of things were much less syncopation based, but much more rhythmically complex, if you will, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a big part of that is because they basically are two totally different styles, but there again, having come from being a drummer first, it is much more apparent how different the styles have to be. But repetition plays a really big part of it in soloing for rock music, especially for drummers, because you're repeating phrases several times, especially when you're not playing a pitched instrument. But I guess my question to you is why does repetition seem so much more important for rock music for soloing versus jazz?
That's a really good question. I don't really know why. It's one of those things I've just kind of taken it at face value of, oh, it's a thing that happens. I feel like it's kind of a melodic equivalent to a riff, or short for rhythmic figure, like a short little I took a history of rock course in college, and the professor who taught it used as like the opening bit to like get us into like what rock music is, and then we eventually, it was more of like a start to finish kind of history, but we started with basic musical components because it was of course designed not for music majors, and we used You Really Got Me by the Kinks, and like explaining like what a riff is, and that whole like you really got me, you really got me, and just that 1 2 3 4 5 note little shape, and just using that over and over again. And it's the repetitive nature of the guitar riff, the repetitive nature of the singing, the repetitive nature of almost literally every aspect of that idea of like kind of driving it and hitting you in the face with it. And I think the fact that so much repetition exists in melodies is because it kind of comes from that same camp of like, just do this one short little simple thing over and over again and just kind of keep playing with it. And I find it's most effective when you're using it irregularly, doing like a 3-note idea in the context of 4 beats, like 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2, think of like the opening drum bit for Rock and Roll by Led Zeppelin that has and like just it's just a 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 thing, but the fact that it keeps getting displaced in the bar line, it really makes it for an interesting rhythmic content, and that applies exactly the same way to a guitar solo. Just you could literally think of just you know what, I was just teaching just the other day. I was teaching the opening solo for Johnny Be Good to a guitar student,
Okay.
and just that little 1 2 3
Yeah.
1 2 3, just it's literally just bending a note, and that's it, and then hitting the note and then bending it again. But the fact that it's 3/8 notes in a 4/4 bar, it makes
Right.
it really, now it's on the down, now it's on the up, now it's on the down again, now it's on the up, and it just creates this really interesting, fun feeling, and it's simple and it's effective and it's powerful. And I think that it just kind of stems into even more complex solo language in rock and roll. It kind of comes from that same sort of school of thought.
No, I think you're right. I mean, a big part I kind of notice is that when it comes time for rock soloing, and one of my favorite examples of this, of the concept of like these different rhythms working kind of opposite of each other, is the concept of putting triplets against like a duple feel. And
Mhm.
one of the best examples I've seen of that is like Steve Lukather's guitar solo in Rosanna by Toto. And
Mhm.
he does this constantly in rock tunes, is that most of his solos are triplet based when you're playing in like a duple time signature. And the thing is that like, because they naturally oppose that as a polyrhythm, it makes them so much more prominent and kind of like in
Yeah,
your
it really
face.
makes them pop. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It does. That's exactly right. It makes them pop. And it's not quite a syncopation thing. It's more like an opposition of two rhythms that don't evenly match than anything else. And I think you're right. I think the repetition is a big part of it too. And, a lot of it is you repeat things enough times, it kind of gets in your head. And, there's jazz stuff that does that too. But I think about something like,
It gets a lot more rare though.
exactly. Like I think about
Yeah.
something like taking a listen to John Coltrane's version of My Favorite Things, which is a fantastic, fantastic piece of music. But it's an 11-minute long piece of music, and it's basically one extremely large solo with obviously the main tune in there as well. Um, but you're not going to get that same type of repetition in 11-minute piece of music with multiple solos as you're going to get in a rock tune with like a cut and dry solo section with a solo that you could sing and you could like hum after you listen to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. 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 There's definitely an emphasis on simplicity in a lot of rock playing that, as important as it is, I feel like it kind of goes so oft overlooked, because like, oh, I want to just play more notes faster, and I want to like really shred, and I want to really like show how fast I can play my notes. And it kind of then I feel like that's like a real common beginner mistake that a lot of aspiring students make, is they try to fit in too much content into too short of a section. And it's like, dude, just sit on one note and hit that for like 2 entire bars of the whole solo, and it'll make for a really, really powerful impact. And it'll, inadvertently, then it will let your solo have a little bit of breathing room. It'll give it a little bit of that negative space that we still have to talk
Yeah, that
about.
I actually wanted to talk about. That was one I
Yeah.
really wanted to bring up, was like the concept of using empty space or negative space to make a solo more effective. Because you're
Yeah.
right. Most of us, like a beginner mistake most of us would make as a soloist is, well, the more notes I put into it, obviously the better it's going to be. So
Right.
that importance in negative space becomes such an important thing of not only giving breathing room to a phrase, but I think it also makes it easier on a listener's ear as well. It makes something, you know, they can kind of digest it a little bit better, if that makes sense as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a big part of that negative space concept that's really tough to understand is that like the absence of playing notes is just as much of a conscious choice as the actual playing of notes. It's almost like a minimalist concept to some extent. It's like,
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a kind of a real big part of it too. I mean, I think you wind up having a totally different tradition of that in different styles of music. Like, again, saying it's like a minimalist type of thing. Well, okay, what are we talking like, like a Philip Glass tune or something like that? But no, in that case, I think that empty space is really helpful. I think it allows breathing room, but I think it's probably one of the hardest concepts to teach. And I'm sure you could speak to this as well, but like trying to teach a student, okay, so play this idea and then add some space here, or space them out, or wind up spacing them in this direction. It's tough. It makes it tough to do because we don't usually consider the absence of something being played as an important concept. But I think it's probably one of the most important things for a solo.
Yeah, as they say, the rest is noise. It's such an important point, and I feel like a big part of why that is so hard to teach is because when you're a student taking a solo, and you only have, okay, it's 16 bars and then your solo's over. So like you only have this limited window of time, and it's like you feel like you're wasting that time if you're not actively doing something. And there becomes this inherent pressure to try to do something to perform. And in that case, what results in so much space being filled up that we never get that chance for the solo to really breathe and for the notes that are played to be more impactful.
So how do you explain that to a student then? But again, the idea most of us would have is I have 16 bars to solo. I want to put as much as I can into these 16 bars. How do you explain that like then the notes you don't play matter almost as much as the notes you do play?
Yeah, the only way I could think of off the top of my head is just literally forcing them to do it. Like, okay, play for a bar and then don't play for a bar. So like do like full measures at a time of like leave a measure of empty space. Just literally don't play, and then you kind of start making that window shorter. Of like, all right, now maybe let's say we're in 4/4. So okay, so you play for a measure and then you have the first 2 beats of the next measure you can't do anything, but then you could fill in the rest of the bar. And then you gradually like, okay, now the first beat you can't do anything, and then once you get down to like a 1 to 2 beat window, you can play it with the placement of that window of like, all right, solo until the 3rd beat and then don't play beats 3 and 4, and then you can come back in on 1 2 3 4 1 2, stop on 3 4. You can kind of play with that, but like I feel like you literally have to just force a student to do it, to like let them kind of think. And now it's like, instead of thinking I only got 16 bars, now it's like, what can I do with this one phrase in this first bar before I have to take a break? And then it forces them, instead of thinking of the whole solo, now they're thinking of little chunks of it. And then you eventually kind of ease back into, now you can kind of do whatever you want, but try to throw in some space here and there, whether it's every other bar or it's every 4 bars. Maybe you play an entire 4-bar thing and then you have a stop at the end of it. You can kind of get creative. Again, you just for me, so much of my teaching is playing with permutations. Take that one little thing and then move it to all the different little possible factors of, in this case, a beat of arrest, moving where that beat of arrest is. And then changing the size, making it 2 beats, making it 4 beats. I feel that a really good way you can do it in an ensemble setting is with trading bars. It's a big thing in jazz. Like trading 4s, trading 2s. And then it's like, all right, instead of thinking of the entire solo, now I'm thinking, what am I going to do with my one little spotlight here? I get this one measure to do something, and then I have to trade it off to a friend. And then it forces a student to just think about their playing differently. And then once you kind of open it back up to they can do whatever they want, more often than not, like I can attest to this as a player. I've found with, like, for me, thinking in those smaller windows leads to much better solo playing, because I'm putting a lot more thought into what I am playing, instead of just filling space and doing whatever. You know what I mean? So
no, you're exactly right.
That's the way I would do it. I'm sure there are many other better strategies out there. I just don't know them.
Well, I like the idea of doing something like a trading 4s type of situation, because I think when you're not in a situation where you have to fill 16 bars worth of space, when somebody tells you, okay, you have 2 bars or you have 4 bars to play a part of a solo, well, you can't fit an entire solo into 4 bars. So you play a part of something, or you play a small lick, or you play a small melody. I think you're right. I think that does, help a lot in helping a student to realize that you can do more with less sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
Than you would think.
And you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone that way too, because that way, for one solo section, now you're having 3 or 4 kids play at a time, and they're all getting a chance to solo a little bit, which is, another good benefit of doing it that way.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think the main point that we're kind of getting to here, really, for all of this we've been talking about, is that, like, improvisation being as important as it is, it's something that as a teacher, as a student, you have to learn in steps. You have to teach it in steps. There's no end all be all great way.
Even though
it is totally
the nature of what it is free form, there's definitely a sort of kind of scientific method you can apply to it, of like,
you can
this source data and then experiment with it, and then then you kind of especially something I can't believe we went this long without mentioning this: record.
Oh yeah,
have your students record themselves
and
playing,
listen to what they
especially
play.
now, dude. Everyone's got a smartphone or a tablet or some device that can make really nice quality recordings. I'm always harping on my kids to just record yourself play and then listen back to it. As much as that, it's a really awful experience at first. That so many people just hate listening to themselves, but and when you hear yourself play, it's like, oh God, but I know for me, it worked wonders when I was learning to do jazz soloing on piano in college. I recorded myself almost every practice session. I listened back and like, all right, that stuff worked. That stuff did not. And now I know the next time what I'm going to try to do differently to make it even better. And I found that I improved greatly over a pretty small window of time by doing it that way. So um, I forget where I was going with that. I got into recording and now I'm on the box, but
Oh, I mean, but no, that's another good aspect too. I think that's actually something you could do to supplement that teaching about improvisation for your students, or either for a performer themselves, is just to record, to try it in
listen back
multiple
to your own
steps, to
recording.
listen to what you're doing, to pick and choose what works well and what doesn't. I think the important thing to stress, and I can't stress this enough and emphasize this enough, is to let a student know that it is not going to be perfect the first time you try it. It won't be perfect the 50th time you try it. It won't be perfect pretty much any time you try it.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's part of the nature of what it is.
well, no, you're exactly right. And I think part of it, again, most of us get caught up in this concept of, if I can't get it perfect, I don't want to play it in front of other people. And to
Yeah,
improvise
that's
is
the
to,
problem with improvisation. There is no perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect solo.
exactly. But I think you can definitely teach everybody to be comfortable with what they play and to enjoy the process. But I think it starts with a lot of small steps throughout the entire span of learning as a musician, and for a
Yeah,
teacher,
and
a lot
scaffolding
of
it as
small
much as
deliberate
possible.
steps along your student's path.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah,
figured,
I would agree 100%.
yeah, and like I was saying, I think we pretty much put the nail on the head with that one. But I figured before we go, we would bring back a segment that we used in the last podcast, and now that we've titled, instead of grind my gears, we've now entitled this "Good Gripes." So I
Good
figured,
gripes.
I love it. It's great. And I figured, since we've been talking about improvisation, we could talk about the concept of solos gone wrong. Basically, kind of discussing common improvisation faux pas, if you will. Things you've heard, or things you've played, or personally experienced, that just turned a solo from uh, a collection of notes to being a slight disaster. So, Dan, you want to start us off?
Sure. So for me, my gripe with this overall concept in music, this whole domain of improvisation, comes from the perspective of a teacher, and I have gripes with, especially because I have a lot of experience working in rock scenarios, and there were so many circumstances in my overall teaching career, across a number of different jobs I've had, where teachers that are teaching students to improvise in an ensemble setting, it's one of those like modeling is very useful of a teaching tool. Demonstration is very useful of a teaching tool. I don't think it's so useful when it comes to teaching improvisation, because then the teacher is putting more of the emphasis. It just becomes like a look what I can do.
Yeah.
I find that you're not really effectively giving students ideas of what they can do. You're if nothing else, you're literally just taking time away from a student's opportunity to
Mhm.
experiment and try and do things. Because it's one of those, like, yeah, you could demonstrate like how to properly play a piece, but like to teach improvisation through demonstration and modeling, it's kind of a dicey thing. You have to be really careful when you're doing it. And I say this, I feel like such a hypocrite for saying it, because I was just having a pretty extensive set of lessons with a particular student of mine in piano, and I pretty much exclusively used demonstration for the purpose of teaching this student in his lessons. And but like the way I tried to like really sort of set myself apart from other teachers is like, let me kind of like explain the process as I'm doing it. Let me like, all right, okay, student, if you're going to try this, here's what I would do if I was trying to come up with solo ideas, you know, and I would like kind of talk him through the process and basically kind of showcase the process, not so much the product, you know. And I feel like so many teachers get that wrong, and they just kind of jump in. It's like, oh, well, if I just jump in solo, it's going to encourage my kids to play. And I've never seen that work. You know, if anything, it's going to make the student like, oh man, I can't play like that. So I don't even want to jump in and play at all. And it becomes a little bit of this kind of egotistical sort of watch what I can do. And you're starving your kids of, you know, valuable instructional time to learn how to do a new, interesting, creative skill. So that's my gripe. You know, teachers don't teach students how to solo by just soloing all the time. It's borderline useless unless you're really smart about how you convey it to your students.
Okay. I know I have one personally, some from personal experience and some from things I've seen. My gripe is for performers when you approach a solo without a direction in mind. And you can usually tell. Yeah, you can usually tell, like when you watch somebody solo and when they have a kind of a goal in mind, a direction, a loose path as to what they're going to follow, you can tell because they have a clear beginning, a middle section, which usually includes some type of rhythmic or melodic flourish in it, and then a means to end the phrase. But when somebody doesn't have an idea in mind of what they're going to do, oh, you can tell. You can really tell. It's like they're grasping at straws trying to find a way to finish an idea that they've come up with.
Yeah, it's like almost sad to see.
What's this?
It's almost sad to see. It's like watching like a fly like drowning in a swimming pool, you know. And it's like, how do I save it? You know, what can I want to see him get out, but it's just it's hopeless. I feel so bad for him.
It's almost, and I've seen this a few times in, you know, my years as a musician. I've experienced that a few times as well. Just trying to, you know, come up with solo ideas or to be able to do anything improvisation based. I almost feel like it's the general equivalent of like that quote from the Phantom Menace where he's like, let's try spinning, that's a good trick. Let's try playing these scales, that's a good trick. You know, a big part of that really comes down to soloing is much more a predetermined mental activity before you actually get to the spot in which you take the time to solo. And if you don't take that time to think about it before you actually get up there to solo, you're going to flounder. Yeah. Only the best of the best can really like just rip off a solo and no problem without even thinking about like, sure, I'll just play this and be done with it.
Yeah, and I mean, like if you're Eddie Van Halen, you could totally do that.
Yeah, if you're like Eddie Van Halen or you're Rick Wakeman to the world, or you're Steve Vai.
It was something we mentioned in the Rock Talk episode, how we talked about his solo for Beat It by Michael Jackson, and he literally just showed up and like just did it for fun, and like in like one take had like this awesome solo. And like if you're on that level, yeah, sure, you could just jump in and do whatever. But for the most part, yeah, you definitely, it's funny because like how freeform and loose in nature improvisation is on paper, the best improvised solos usually it's just like giving a speech, you know, having like at least like a list of bullet points, you know. Yeah. It's just like what we do for these episodes on the podcast, you know. Russell kind of puts out like a little detail of here are some basic talking points, here's a couple questions, and we use that and we do the podcast. You know, it's not necessarily a word for word script that we're reading. That's a whole different way to present and perform, and that's what you do when you're playing rehearsed music. But when you're improvising, it's just like giving a speech where you want to have a couple of like some actual points that you want to at least kind of touch on, and then you can kind of go about those points in any way you want, and you can do things a little differently. And that's another nice thing you can teach about improvising is, all right, let's build a framework together, and then let's use that same framework several times and see how many different ways you can apply it. So yeah, going in without a plan is not the best plan.
Yeah, for something like you said, for something that's, you know, a free form type of situation, it's really not all that free form now, is it?
No, it's interestingly enough, it really isn't.
So, I mean, you know, I think that kind of begs the point, like we were saying before, is that it's an important thing that you have to learn in steps. And that, like I even said back at the very beginning, I truly believe it's a cyclical curriculum type of situation where you have to revisit it over and over and over again, not only as a student or as a performer, but also as a teacher, you know, instructing students. It's something where if you're going to make an active attempt at it, I think it starts really early on and you revisit it and just expand it slowly as you go, because there's no better way to get used to it than that.
Yeah, it's never too early to start teaching. Like I said in the beginning of this podcast, sometimes I've worked with for on day one lessons with a beginner student. Like, let's just make something up on the spot just for fun, even if it's 2 notes, whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's
No,
a really good way to open that door for them.
no, but you're exactly right. It's never too early to start working on improvisation, and it's never too early to start teaching your students how to make their own guided choices when it comes time for music and how they create it. Well, Dan, do you have any final points before we wrap up today?
Yeah, so I guess a really good way we could wrap this up, I'm gonna bounce back to our, one of my earlier points about our Facebook page. We now have so many members that are joining up, and honestly, it's super humbling to see how quickly this thing is really taking off, and that's awesome. Those of you that have been following, last episode we got to feature 2 guests, and we plan to do so much more of that in the future. And bring different people in to share different perspectives from all walks of life, whether that's the public school thing, the private teaching thing, the just being a performer thing. So it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of colorful cast of characters we can include here. But for those of you that were watching for this one, if you have any other techniques or teaching strategies, whether it's in your school ensemble or with your private students, if you have, there are probably some strategies we never even mentioned here. So if you have any that you'd like to share and you think you can contribute some useful tidbits for other teachers to benefit from, feel free. Just if you're in the group, just punch in, make a comment, make a post, share some information, share articles, share resources. This whole platform is just to create a nice little positive online community for all of us teachers to work together and to grow during this difficult time. So
No, and Dan,
feel free to make some posts about improvisation, and we'll be following up. Our next episode will cover a different topic entirely, but for all of these we could easily come back to any of the topics we've touched on so far, and I'm sure another improvisation episode will come in the future. So thanks
no,
so much for watching
yeah.
and tuning in and following us. The support has been really, really great. So all I have to say is thank you.
And I'm right there alongside you with that too. I can't thank those who have joined the group enough. And Dan, you're exactly right. This is one of those type of situations where we really want to create a community for music teachers, performers, students, anybody doing anything related to music, parents of students who are learning in that situation.
We want to be a
be able
resource.
to, exactly, to have a resource available to them, to be able to join the conversation, just to be able to have a little bit more music and talking about it in their lives. I think that's a really big, important part of it. And Dan, like you said, for those of you out there who are listening, who have joined the group, and for those who will join the group, join the conversation. This is not meant for us to sit here for an hour at a time and talk at you. This is for us basically to start a conversation that we want all of you to be a part of. And
so don't be shy.
Yeah, don't be shy, because we're certainly not being shy about it.
Yeah, totally.
By all means, if you have tips, tricks, resources that you'd like to use, or that you use for teaching students, or that you used when you were a student or a performer, by all means, please share them. It's always helpful for everybody involved.
I'm always looking for new ways to learn how to teach. You're never done learning. Never.
Exactly. You're never done learning. And not only that, one of the most important things that I truly believe, and I'm sure Dan's right alongside of me there with that too, is that you are not a monolith as a teacher, as a student, as a performer. This is a collaborative art, a collaborative lifestyle, if you will, in that we all kind of lean and rely on each other to make ourselves greater than the sum of the parts. And in that sense, that's the kind of the concept of the community behind Teacher Talk and what we want to do.
Absolutely.
So we definitely want to hear from you. And we want to thank you for tuning in and listening to us, talk about some improvisation for a good hour or so. And we'll see you in the next episode.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Until then, happy teaching.